Beatrice Pemberton had not been to the attic in 42 years of marriage. Lawrence had his reasons for that, or so she had always assumed, the way she had always assumed there were reasons for the things Lawrence did that she did not fully understand. He was a genius, after all. Geniuses required certain privacies. The world had told her this so many times, and in so many ways that she had stopped questioning it the way you stop questioning the weather. He had been in the ground for 3 weeks when she finally climbed the stairs. She was not looking for anything in particular. She was a former librarian, and she was doing what librarians do when faced with an unorganized collection. She was taking inventory, tax records, award citations, photographs from decades of industry events in which Lawrence stood at the center of every frame with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to being looked at. She pulled back the wool rug in the northwest corner because one edge had caught on something, and the floorboard beneath it shifted under her hand. The safe was below it, small and mechanical, dusty, in the way of something that has not been touched in a very long time but has been remembered. She tried his birthday, his date of birth, their wedding anniversary. Nothing. Then she tried the date Pemberton Energy had gone public, the number Lawrence had called the most important day of his life, the day the empire became real. The safe opened. Inside, wrapped in dark velvet with the care of someone preserving something precious, was a document. She unfolded it under the attic's single light. The header read in clean technical type, Finchley Solid State Cell, drawing number 1. October 17th, 1982. In the lower right corner was a signature she did not recognize, Arthur Finchley. Beside it, a witness signature and the ink stamp of the Applied Physics Laboratory at the University of Northern California. 14 months before Lawrence filed his patent. She turned to the next page. 3 laboratory notebooks, covers worn to softness, pages dense with equations and observations, and the particular handwriting of a man working through something he loved. Every page carried the same name in the upper corner, Arthur Finchley. At the bottom of the safe was an envelope, the paper gone amber with age. The letter inside was 2 pages, the handwriting unsteady, in the way of someone writing under great pressure or great grief or both. Lawrence, it began, I know what you intend to do. If you do it, understand that my notebooks still exist. One day someone will open them, and when they do, the world will know what you are. You are not a genius. You are a thief. Signed, Arthur. Beatrice sat on the attic floor with the letter in her hands, and the dust around her, and 42 years of a life she had believed in, completely settling into a shape she did not recognize. The man she had loved, the man she had admired, the man whose name was on a $4 billion company and on hospital wings and on the lips of every person who had ever told her how fortunate she was to be married to him. He had not invented anything. He had stolen everything. The Pemberton safe. Lawrence Pemberton's obituary had run in 11 national publications. Beatrice had read all of them. She had sat at the kitchen table on the mornings they appeared and read each one with the careful attention she had brought to everything she read in 35 years as a librarian, which meant she read for accuracy and for what was absent as much as for what was present. The obituaries described a visionary, a pioneer, a man who had transformed the energy industry with a single invention and had spent the subsequent 4 decades building that invention into something that powered hospitals and spacecraft and the devices in the pockets of 2 billion people. They described Lawrence Pemberton as a self-made genius. Beatrice had read that phrase in 7 of the 11 obituaries and had thought each time that it was the kind of phrase that sounded like information but was actually an absence of it. Self-made. Made by himself, from nothing, from pure intelligence, from the particular quality of mind that certain men are said to possess, and that the world agrees to stop questioning once it has made them rich enough. She set the last obituary down and looked at the flowers. There were still flowers everywhere 3 weeks after the funeral because they had kept arriving for the first 2 weeks, and the staff had nowhere to put them and no instruction to remove them, and Beatrice had not thought to give that instruction because she had been occupied with the specific interior work of a person whose life has just changed its fundamental shape and who requires time to understand what the new shape is. The condolence letters were stacked on the credenza in the front hall. She had read those too, or enough of them to understand their pattern. They were letters to the widow of Lawrence Pemberton, which meant they were letters about Lawrence Pemberton, which meant they were in their way additional obituaries. She was present in them as context, as setting, as the woman who had supported his genius for 42 years. She had been that among other things. Diana came at 10 on a Tuesday morning, which was when Diana always came when she had something to manage. She was 48 and had her father's certainty and her father's way of organizing a room around herself, without appearing to do so that conversations happened on her terms and in her structure before anyone had noticed that a structure had been imposed. She sat in the main sitting room with her coffee and her leather portfolio and looked at her mother with the expression of a woman who has a plan and considers the plan reasonable. The apartment was in Whitebridge, which was 40 minutes from the city, and was described in its own materials as a premier continuing care community with resort-style amenities. Diana had a brochure which she placed on the table between them without opening it as a signal that the option existed and had been researched. The estate, Diana explained, was primarily held through Pemberton Energy's family trust structure, which Morgan and the board would be managing in the interest of continuity. The house itself was a trust asset. There were provisions for Beatrice, naturally, a monthly income, the Whitebridge apartment, the car. It had all been structured by Lawrence's estate attorneys, whose names and firm Beatrice recognized because she had typed their Christmas card addresses for 30 years. "You'll be more comfortable there," Diana said. "The house is too large for one person, and the business side of things isn't really your world, Mom." Beatrice looked at her daughter. She had a habit developed over 35 years of reference work of listening to what people said while simultaneously noting what they assumed. Diana was assuming that her mother's world was small, which was a reasonable assumption based on the evidence available to Diana, who had grown up watching her mother arrange dinner parties and attend industry events and stand beside Lawrence in photographs with the pleasant composure of a woman who understood that her function in those images was to be pleasant and composed. What Diana had not seen, because it had never been offered to her view, was her mother at work. A research librarian at a university does not simply file books. She builds systems for organizing knowledge. She learns to read the difference between a primary source and a derivative one. She develops the specific literacy of someone who has handled thousands of documents over decades and can tell from the weight and texture and age of a paper from the particular characteristics of a typeface, or a handwriting, or an institutional seal, whether what she is holding is what it claims to be. Beatrice had spent 35 years becoming exceptionally good at knowing when a document was authentic. She had not thought about why that skill might matter at home until 3 days before Lawrence died, when he had taken her hand in the hospital room and said something she had not fully understood. His voice had been very quiet, and his words had not been entirely clear, the way words are not entirely clear when a person is using the last of what they have to say them. She had heard "gachmai," which was not English, which did not make sense, and then she had heard "forgive me," which was English and which she had assumed was the general statement that dying people sometimes make. It was only later, sitting in the sitting room on a Tuesday morning while Diana described the Whitebridge apartment's amenities, that she understood he had said attic, not something in another language, and that "forgive me" had not been a general statement. She looked at the ceiling. The attic had always been Lawrence's space. He had been specific about this from the beginning of their marriage in a way that she had accepted without questioning the way she had accepted many things about Lawrence's specific requirements, because he was the kind of man whose requirements seemed reasonable at the time they were established, and whose habit of establishing them was so consistent that you stopped noticing you had never questioned any of them. She stood up. Diana looked at her with the expression of a woman whose conversation has been interrupted before its natural conclusion. "I'll move," Beatrice said, "but first I need to go through the attic." She picked up her coffee cup, which she had not finished, and set it on the tray, with the precision of someone who does not leave things where they do not belong. "There may be things up there that should be organized before the estate process begins." Diana's expression shifted slightly. "There's nothing up there. Lawrence used it for storage." Beatrice looked at her daughter for a moment. In 35 years of reference work, she had learned to recognize the specific quality of certainty that comes not from knowledge, but from the assumption that something has already been settled. Diana was certain there was nothing in the attic because she had never been told there was anything in the attic, which was a different kind of certainty and a less reliable one. "I'll only be an hour," Beatrice said. She left the room before Diana could redirect the conversation, which was something she had almost never done in 42 years of marriage, and was finding at 68 surprisingly straightforward. The attic stairs were at the end of the third-floor corridor behind a door she had walked past 10,000 times. She opened it and went up. The attic smelled of time. That was the first thing she noticed before her eyes had adjusted to the light from the single window at the far end, the particular smell of a space that has been sealed against the regular movement of air for a very long time. Dust and old paper, and the specific staleness of accumulated decades. She had encountered this smell in library archive rooms in the special collections vaults, where the oldest materials were kept, and she had always found it clarifying, rather than oppressive. It was the smell of things that had lasted. She stood at the top of the stairs and looked. The space was larger than she had imagined. Lawrence had never described it, and she had never asked which she now recognized as one of a series of things about their marriage that she had accepted as normal, because the alternative was to notice them, and noticing them would have required her to ask questions that Lawrence's particular manner of occupying a room had always made feel unnecessary. There were trunks against the east wall, the good leather kind that had been fashionable in a certain decade. Filing boxes stacked in organized columns, each one labeled in Lawrence's handwriting with years and categories. Award citations she could see from here. Conference materials. Early company records. The archived history of a life that the world had understood as the life of a genius, organized with the neat self-consciousness of a man who expected his papers to matter to historians. She went to the trunks first and worked systematically the way she had always worked, opening and reviewing and closing noting contents without removing them unless something required closer examination. Tax records from the early years, photographs she had not seen before Lawrence at conferences, Lawrence at universities, Lawrence with his hand on the shoulder of various people she did not recognize. She put those aside to look at later. She was moving toward the second column of boxes when her foot caught on the edge of the wool rug in the northwest corner, and she looked down. The rug had shifted. One corner had folded back on itself, and beneath it the floorboard was not flush with its neighbors. A gap, slight but visible along one edge. The board was the same wood and the same age as the surrounding floor, but it sat differently, the way a page sits differently, when it has been removed from a book and replaced the fiber memory of the binding no longer holding it in its original position. She crouched down, which required more care than it once had, and pressed the board with both hands. It moved. She worked her fingers into the gap and lifted it, and below was a space perhaps 10 inches deep, and in the space was a safe. It was small and mechanical, the kind that predated electronic keypads, a combination dial in gunmetal gray that had accumulated a light surface rust but was structurally intact. The kind of safe that was built to last, because it was built in an era when things were built to last. She sat back on her heels and looked at it. Lawrence had put this here himself. Had cut the space in the floorboard, or had it cut, had installed the safe, had replaced the board, had placed the rug over it, and had not told her. 42 years. She had walked past this corner of a room she never entered for 42 years while this sat beneath the floor. She tried his birthday. Nothing. Their wedding date. Nothing. She sat for a moment and thought about what date Lawrence would have considered the most significant of his life, the date that represented the apex of what he believed he had built. He had told her once at a dinner celebrating the company's 30th anniversary that the IPO was the day he understood that what he had created would outlast him. He had said it with the particular quality of satisfaction that she had always taken as the natural feeling of a man who had made something real. She entered the IPO date. The mechanism turned and the door swung open. Inside, resting on the base of the safe, was a bundle wrapped in dark velvet and tied with a narrow ribbon that had once been black and had faded to a soft gray. She lifted it with both hands. It was lighter than she expected and heavier than she expected simultaneously, the way things are when their physical weight is less than their actual weight. She set it on the floor and untied the ribbon and opened the velvet. The drawing was on top. She had handled technical documents in the university library's engineering collection for years. She knew what a properly executed technical drawing looked like, the specific conventions of labeling and notation and authentication that distinguished a working document from a copy or a draft. This was a primary document. She could see it in the paper weight, the ink quality, the institutional stamp. Finchley Solid State Cell Drawing Number 1, October 17, 1982. Arthur Finchley. The signature was in the lower right corner, executed with the particular deliberateness of someone signing something they intended to last. Beside it, a witness signature she could not read clearly, and the ink stamp of the Applied Physics Laboratory at the University of Northern California, the date pressed into the paper rather than printed on it, permanent in the way that institutional seals are designed to be permanent. She turned the drawing over and looked at the back. Nothing. She turned it face up again and looked at the date. October 17, 1982. Lawrence had filed his patent in December of 1983. She knew this because the patent filing date was part of the company's founding mythology, the date that appeared in every corporate history and every profile and every obituary she had read over the past 3 weeks. 14 months? She set the drawing down with the care of someone setting down something irreplaceable and picked up the notebooks. There were 3 bound in leather that had gone soft with age, each one filled from cover to cover in a handwriting she did not recognize. Small, precise, the handwriting of someone accustomed to fitting a great deal of information into a limited space. Equations she could not follow. Diagrams she recognized as related to the drawing. Dates running from March through December of 1982, a complete chronological record of a process of discovery. The failures were there, the dead ends, the revisions, the incremental progress of a mind working through a problem with patience and rigor. Every page carried a name in the upper corner, Arthur Finchley. She put the notebooks down and picked up the envelope. The paper had gone the color of old ivory. The flap had been sealed and then at some point carefully opened the seal, separated with something thin and precise, a letter opener or a blade, so that the envelope could be closed again without appearing to have been opened. Lawrence had read this letter. He had read it, and he had put it back in the envelope, and he had placed it in the safe, and he had sealed the floor above it, and he had built a $4 billion company on top of it. She unfolded the pages. The handwriting was different from the notebook's looser, the handwriting of someone writing under pressure rather than documenting with precision. 2 pages, the second page only half filled the signature at the bottom, followed by a date. She read it slowly. Lawrence had been Arthur's research assistant. That was how it began, with a fact so ordinary she read past it at first. Arthur had trusted him, had given him access to the laboratory, to the notebooks, to the process as it developed, because trust of that kind was natural between a senior researcher and the assistant he had chosen and trained. Lawrence had been present for every stage of the discovery. He had understood perhaps better than anyone else what Arthur had created and what it was worth. The letter did not describe what Lawrence had done in detail, because Arthur had apparently believed Lawrence already knew what he had done. It was not an account of the theft. It was a letter from a man who had learned he was about to lose everything and who wanted the person responsible to know that the record existed. "My notebooks still exist," Arthur had written. "The drawing still exists. One day someone will open them, and when they do, the world will know what you are. You are not a genius. You are a thief." Beatrice read the last line and then read it again. She folded the letter along its existing creases and returned it to the envelope with the same careful movements she had used when handling damaged materials in the archive. You handle damaged things with care, not because they are beyond harm, but because they have already been harmed enough. She sat on the attic floor with the velvet bundle in her lap and the dust around her and the afternoon light coming through the single window, and she thought about 42 years. The dinners, the industry events, the photographs, The 11 obituaries and the condolence letters stacked in the front hall, and Diana sitting in the downstairs parlor with her brochure for the White Bridge Continuing Care Community. She thought about Lawrence in the hospital room, his hand in hers, his voice barely there. "Attic, forgive me." He had not destroyed the evidence. He had kept it in a safe beneath the floor of a room he had not permitted her to enter for 42 years. She turned this over in her mind with the same systematic attention she brought to any document whose provenance required examination. Not guilt. She did not think it was guilt that had made him keep it. A man who kept a theft's evidence in a safe did not keep it because he regretted the theft. He kept it because he could not bring himself to destroy the proof of what he had taken. Because the proof was the only acknowledgement, however private, that there had been something worth taking, that the genius had been real, even if it had not been his. She looked at the drawing. Arthur Finchley, October 17th, 1982. She said the name aloud quietly in the empty attic. Then she gathered the documents and went downstairs to find out who he was. She went to the university on a Wednesday morning. She had called ahead, which was habit, and had spoken to the current head of special collections, a woman named Dr. Aldridge, whom she did not know, and had explained that she was a former staff member researching a matter related to the university's history in the early 1980s. Dr. Aldridge had been courteous and had said the archive would be available. Beatrice drove the 40 minutes to campus with the documents in a flat archival box she had taken from the supply closet in Lawrence's study, which was where she had always kept archival materials because Lawrence's study had the most stable humidity in the house, and she had learned early in her career that documents preferred consistency. She had wrapped the velvet bundle inside acid-free tissue and placed it carefully in the box and set the box on the passenger seat. She had not told Diana where she was going. The campus looked as it always had, which was both comforting and disorienting in the way that returning to a place you have been absent from for some years is always slightly disorienting. The library was where she had left it naturally, a mid-century building that had been expanded twice since she started working there in 1975, and that still had in its original wing the particular smell of institutional carpet and old wood and the climate-controlled air that good libraries maintain because the materials require it. She signed in at the special collections desk and was taken to the reading room. She had not told Dr. Aldridge what she was specifically looking for, which was a professional habit. You tell a librarian the category and let the librarian find the path because librarians know their collections in ways that are not entirely systematized and that require conversation rather than query. She asked for the faculty records from the Applied Physics Department, 1978 through 1986. She asked for the university newspaper archives for the same period. She asked for the Patent and Technology Transfer Office records if they were accessible. She waited while these were retrieved, sitting at a long table with her archival box in front of her, and she looked at the room she had helped to design 30 years ago. The arrangement of the tables, the lighting over the reading stations, the small signs she had written herself that explained the handling protocols for fragile materials. Some of them were still there. The lamination had yellowed slightly. The records came in 4 boxes. She started with the faculty files. Arthur Finchley appeared in the 1978 hiring records, appointed as assistant professor of applied physics at the age of 37 with a doctorate from MIT and a previous position at a national laboratory whose name she recognized. The hire had been described in the department chair's memo as an exceptional appointment, a researcher whose work in solid-state materials had already attracted attention from the energy industry. There were annual review records through 1983, each one noting with increasing enthusiasm the progress of his research into solid-state battery technology. The 1983 review described a breakthrough that the department chair considered potentially significant enough to warrant a university patent application. The 1984 records were different. There was a gap where the annual review would have been, and in its place a series of administrative documents. A complaint filed with the University Research Integrity Office, an investigation record, a finding. She read the finding carefully, The investigation had concluded that Dr. Finchley had misappropriated approximately $200,000 from a federal research grant over a period of 2 years. The evidence presented included financial records and testimony from a research associate named Lawrence Pemberton, who had reported the discrepancy after, as the document described it, becoming aware of irregularities in the laboratory accounts. Testimony from a research associate. She had known Lawrence was young when he filed the patent. The company's history described him as a 26-year-old entrepreneur who had developed a revolutionary technology while working independently. She had never had reason to look more closely at what independently meant in that sentence. He had been Arthur's research assistant. She sat with this for a moment. In the reading room of the library where she had worked for 35 years, she sat and held the administrative finding in both hands and understood the architecture of what Lawrence had done. The theft of the notebooks and the drawings was one crime. The false testimony that had sent Arthur to prison was another. And the 26-year-old who had done both of these things had then walked into her library, and had met a quiet librarian and had married her, and had spent 42 years being celebrated as a genius, while the man he had destroyed served 25 years in a federal penitentiary. She found the newspaper archive next. The university paper had covered the case in 3 issues. She read all 3. The second issue had a photograph of Lawrence that she had seen before, a photograph from the early years of the company that had been used many times over the decades in profiles and retrospectives. In this context, below the headline that described Arthur's conviction, the photograph had a different quality. Lawrence was 27 years old, and he was looking at the camera with the easy confidence of a man who has recently gotten away with something and is beginning to understand the full dimensions of what that means. The quote was in the 3rd paragraph. "It is deeply painful to see a talented colleague fall in this way. I had the highest regard for Dr. Finchley's scientific mind, and I can only say that I hope justice has been properly served." She read it twice. She thought about the word colleague. She thought about Arthur Finchley in his laboratory in 1982, working through the problem of solid-state battery technology with the patience and rigor that the notebooks documented so completely, trusting the young assistant who sat across the room and watched and learned and understood exactly what was being created and what it would be worth. She returned the newspaper archive and requested one additional record: the Patent and Technology Transfer Office files for the period 1982 through 1984. The filing was there. Lawrence had submitted his patent application in December of 1983. The application described the invention in language that she could not fully evaluate technically, but that bore in its structure and approach a clear relationship to the drawing she had in the archival box beside her. The application listed Lawrence Pemberton as sole inventor. She looked at the date of application. December 1983. The drawing in her box was dated October 1982. 14 months. Arthur had created something and Lawrence had taken it and had waited 14 months before filing, presumably, to create sufficient distance that the connection would not be immediately obvious. It was the patience of someone who understood that the difference between a theft discovered immediately and a theft discovered later was often simply time. She packed the archive box and thanked Dr. Aldridge and went to find the person she had noticed when she first arrived, a woman she recognized from years ago sitting at the periodicals desk with the settled quality of someone who has worked in the same place for a very long time. Her name was Ruth Carey, and she had been at the university library for 38 years, and she and Beatrice had been colleagues for most of the time Beatrice had worked there. They had not been close, but they had been the kind of colleagues who know each other well enough that trust is implicit. Ruth looked at her when she approached and said her name with the warmth of old familiarity, and then looked at her face more carefully, and the warmth shifted into something more attentive. They sat in the small staff room off the periodicals section with tea that Ruth made, without asking whether she wanted it, because Ruth was the kind of person who understood that some conversations required something to hold. Ruth said, "Bea, how are you actually?" It was not quite a question. Beatrice set her cup down. "Did you know," she said, "that Lawrence was a research assistant here in the early 1980s, before the company?" Ruth was quiet for a moment in a way that was not the quiet of someone who did not know, but the quiet of someone deciding what to do with what they knew. "I had heard something," she said carefully. "Nothing I could say I knew directly." "Arthur Finchley," Beatrice said. Ruth looked at her hands. "There were people who wondered," she said finally, "at the time. But Lawrence had already filed the patent, and Arthur was in prison, and there was nothing, no evidence, and Lawrence was becoming successful very quickly. People stopped wondering." She looked up. "Bikur," she said, "there is something I should probably tell you. I don't know if it means anything." She paused. "There is a man who comes to the campus every year on the same date. He sits in the reading room for an hour, and he looks at the faculty records from 1984. He has been doing this for as long as I can remember." She paused again. "He always signs in as a visitor. His name is Jasper Quince. He's a retired attorney." Beatrice looked at her. "He was here last month," Ruth said. "He left his card at the desk. I kept it because I didn't know why, but I thought I should." She reached into her desk drawer and placed a small card on the table between them. Beatrice looked at the card, then she put it in her coat pocket beside the archival box. The date Jasper Quince came every year, Ruth had said, was October 17th. The date on Arthur Finchley's drawing. Jasper Quince lived in a ground-floor apartment in a building that had been constructed in the 1960s and maintained with the kind of care that keeps something functional without making it new. The lobby had indoor plants that someone tended consistently, an elevator that worked, and carpet that had been replaced within the past decade. It was the apartment of a man who had ordered his life around what was necessary and had stopped requiring more than that. He opened the door before she knocked, which meant he had been watching for her, which meant the call she had made that morning had mattered to him in a way he had not been able to set aside. He was 72 and looked it, which is to say he looked like a man who had carried something heavy for a long time and had not put it down. He was thin and had the slight stoop of someone who had spent decades at a desk, and his hands, when he shook hers, had the careful quality of hands that had once been precise and were still trying to be. He made tea without asking and brought it to the small table by the window where he had already placed a manila folder, which told her that he had been preparing for this conversation before she arrived, had perhaps been preparing for it for longer than this morning. She placed her archival box on the table beside the folder. They looked at each other for a moment with the mutual assessment of two people who understand that what they are about to discuss is serious and who are each determining whether the other is prepared for the seriousness of it. He said, "You found the safe." It was not a question. She noted this. "Lawrence told you about it," she said. "Not directly, but I knew Lawrence. I knew the kind of man who would keep something like that rather than destroy it." He wrapped both hands around his tea. "I hoped for many years that he had destroyed it, that there was nothing left. And then I would go to the library on the 17th of October, and I would sit with the faculty records, and I would remind myself that hoping was not the same as knowing." He had been 28 years old when he was working at the Patent Office in 1983. He described the work with the precision of someone who had reviewed those months many times in memory. It was examination work, routine in its structure, but requiring a specific kind of literacy, the ability to read a technical application and assess its relationship to what had already been filed and what was known in the field. Lawrence's application had come across his desk in December. He had recognized the technology immediately, not because he knew Arthur Finchley personally, but because Arthur's preliminary filing had been in the system. Arthur had submitted an initial registration in early 1983, a provisional application to establish priority while he completed the formal documentation, the kind of filing that researchers make when they know they have something and want to protect the date while the paperwork catches up. The provisional application had been assigned a case number and had been pending when Lawrence's full application arrived. The provisional application and Lawrence's full filing described the same technology. He had flagged it, had written an internal memo noting the potential conflict and recommending that the examiner request additional documentation from both parties to establish independent development or prior art, had sent the memo up the chain. 3 days later, Lawrence Pemberton had appeared at his office. Jasper stopped here and looked at the window for a moment. He said Lawrence had been very pleasant, had not made threats, had explained in the reasonable tone of a man discussing a straightforward matter that the provisional filing was from a former research associate who had made certain claims that were being addressed through other channels, that there would shortly be a legal resolution that would clarify the situation, and that the examiner's memo, while understandable, was premature and would likely cause unnecessary complication for a process that was already being managed. He had left an envelope on the desk. Jasper had not opened it until after Lawrence left. Inside was enough money to matter significantly to a 28-year-old government examiner. He had kept the money. He had withdrawn his memo. Lawrence's patent had been approved without further complication. Arthur's provisional application had been allowed to lapse for non-payment of the completion fee, a fee that was not large, but that Arthur, by the time it came due, was facing criminal charges and had no access to funds. "I have told this story to no one," Jasper said. "Not to my wife, not to my children. I told it once to a priest 20 years ago in confession, and he told me that acknowledgement of sin was the beginning of repair, and I told him that I did not see how repair was possible, and he did not have an answer for that." He opened the manila folder. Inside were 2 documents. She recognized the format of the first immediately, a patent application cover sheet from the early 1980s, the government printing of that period. The applicant name on the top line was Arthur Finchley. The technology description matched at the level she could assess it, the drawing from the safe. The date was February 1983. The second document was Lawrence's approved patent, December 1983. She placed both documents on the table beside the drawing from the safe and the archival photographs she had made of the notebook pages at the university. She arranged them in chronological order, which was the correct order, the order that told the story accurately. October 1982. Arthur's drawing signed and witnessed and stamped. February 1983. Arthur's provisional patent application. December 1983. Lawrence's approved patent sole inventor. 1984. Arthur's criminal trial. Lawrence's testimony. Arthur's conviction. 1998. Arthur's death in federal custody. She looked at the sequence and felt what she always felt when a finding came clear. Not satisfaction exactly, more the specific sensation of a truth that has been waiting to be correctly organized, finally sitting in its proper order. She had felt it hundreds of times over 35 years, locating a primary source, establishing a provenance, resolving a question that had been open. This was that feeling, and it was also the worst feeling she had ever had. "You've held this for 40 years, she said. "I have," he said. "I am not asking you to understand that or to forgive it. I'm telling you because you came here and because you deserve to know the complete picture, and because I am 72 years old and I am tired of October the 17th. He looked at the documents on the table. "What will you do?" he said. It was not quite a challenge. It was the question of a man who wanted to know if what he was watching was the beginning of something or simply the end of his own private accounting. She looked at the chronological sequence on the table. At Arthur's name appearing 4 times in 4 different documents in 4 different years in 4 different kinds of disappearance. The drawing, the application, the trial record, the death record. "There is a man whose entire life's work was attributed to someone else," she said. "And then he was imprisoned for 40 years on false testimony from the person who stole it. And then he died." She folded her hands on the table in front of her. "The question of what I will do is secondary," she said. "The question is, what is owed?" Jasper looked at her for a long moment. "Arthur had a wife," he said quietly. "Eleanor. They had been married 3 years when he was arrested. She stood by him through the trial. She visited him in prison for the first 8 years until the visits became more painful than the absence, and then she stopped." He paused. "After he died, she moved. She has lived quietly. She is 66 years old." "Where?" Beatrice said. 20 miles from here," he said. "I have her address. I have checked periodically that she was still there. I don't know why. Perhaps because I owed Arthur something, and this was the only form that debt could take." He reached into the folder and removed a small piece of paper and placed it on the table. Beatrice looked at it. Then she placed it in her coat pocket with the same care she had used for every document she had handled since the attic. She stood. "Will you help me?" she said, formally, as a witness to what you saw in 1983. Jasper Quince looked at the folder on the table at 40 years of a thing he had not been able to put down and had not been able to carry properly. "Yes," he said, "I will." Eleanor Finchley lived on the 4th floor of a building on Clement Street, where the elevator worked on most days, and the stairwell smelled of other people's cooking and the particular accumulated life of a building where everyone has lived for a long time and knows each other by sound rather than name. Beatrice had called ahead, which she had almost not done, because she had not known how to explain on the telephone what she needed to explain. She had said only that she had information about Arthur Finchley that she believed Eleanor deserved to have, and that she would understand completely if Eleanor did not want to receive it, and that she would come at whatever time was convenient, or not come at all if that was Eleanor's preference. Eleanor had been quiet for a long moment. Then she had said Thursday at 2 and had given the address and had ended the call before Beatrice could say anything further. The door opened before Beatrice knocked, which meant Eleanor had also been watching for her. She was 66, which Beatrice knew, but the number had not prepared her for the specific quality of Eleanor Finchley's. 66 years, the way they were visible not as age exactly, but as weight. The weight of a person who has carried a particular thing for a very long time and whose body has organized itself around the carrying. She was smaller than Beatrice had pictured, with dark hair gone entirely gray, and the careful posture of someone who has learned to take up only the space she absolutely needs. She looked at Beatrice with the assessment of someone who has had 40 years to think about what it would mean if this moment ever came, and who is now determining whether the moment is actually what she thought it would be. She stepped back from the door. The apartment was 1 bedroom and a sitting room with a kitchen along one wall clean, and ordered with the thoroughness of someone for whom order is not aesthetic preference, but necessary structure. The furniture was old and good, the kind that had been purchased when the purchasing of it represented a significant decision, and had been maintained since with the attention that significant decisions deserve. On the wall above the small sofa was a single photograph. Arthur Finchley was perhaps 35 in the photograph, standing in a laboratory that Beatrice recognized from the university's archives, in a white coat with his hands in his pockets, an expression that she could only describe as being completely present, the expression of someone doing exactly what they are supposed to be doing in exactly the place they are supposed to be doing it. Eleanor saw her looking. "He loved that laboratory," Eleanor said. She said it without particular inflection, a fact that had been true and was still true and would remain true regardless of everything else. "He used to say the problems were always cleaner in the lab than anywhere else. Everything else in life was complicated. But in the lab, either the experiment worked or it didn't." She put the kettle on without asking. They sat at the small table by the window while the kettle heated, and Beatrice placed the archival box on the table between them and did not open it yet because there is an order to things, and the order matters. She said, "I was married to Lawrence Pemberton for 42 years. Eleanor looked at her. She said it without softening it because Eleanor Finchley had spent 40 years with the unsoftened version of this story and deserved to receive its correction in the same register. She opened the archival box and removed the drawing and placed it on the table. She said, "Your husband did not steal anything. My husband did." Eleanor looked at the drawing, at the header, at the date, at the signatures in the lower right corner, at the laboratory stamp with its institutional permanence. She looked at the document the way Beatrice had looked at it in the attic, with the attention of someone whose mind is running very fast through the implications of what they are seeing, while the rest of them remains very still. Her hand moved toward the drawing and then stopped just short of the surface, the instinct to touch it, and the understanding that it was fragile, existing simultaneously. Beatrice said, "You can touch it." Eleanor placed 2 fingers on the paper beside Arthur's signature. She did not trace the letters. She simply rested her fingers there on the paper he had touched in October of 1982, and she looked at his name in his handwriting, and she did not speak for a long time. The kettle began to sound. Eleanor did not move. The kettle finished its noise and the room was quiet again, and Eleanor was still looking at the drawing with her fingers resting beside her husband's name, and Beatrice sat across from her and understood that some moments require only witness and not intervention. When Eleanor finally spoke, her voice was level in the specific way of someone who has been practicing being level for 40 years and for whom levelness is a discipline rather than a natural state. She said, "He told me he didn't do it. From the beginning, every visit, every letter, he said, I did not steal that money, Eleanor. I need you to believe me." She moved her fingers from the drawing. "I believed him," she said, "for a long time. And then I stopped being able to hold both things at once, believing him and watching him in that place and knowing he would never come out. I stopped visiting because I couldn't keep believing and keep watching at the same time, and I chose to stop watching." She paused. "I don't know if that was the right thing. I have never known." Beatrice thought about 40 years of not knowing. She thought about Eleanor telling herself a story about Arthur, a story that began, "I believe you," and ended. "I could not keep coming and living inside that story in this small apartment on Clement Street for 4 decades. She said, "He was right. He didn't take anything. Lawrence created a false financial record. He was the only witness at trial. He testified that he had discovered the discrepancy. The money was never missing. It was fabricated." Eleanor looked at the wall where Arthur's photograph hung. Beatrice reached into the archival box and removed the notebooks one at a time and placed them on the table. 3 notebooks. Arthur's name in the upper corner of every page, his handwriting running through the months of 1982, the careful documentation of a discovery that the world had since attributed to someone else. Eleanor looked at them. She did not open them yet. Then Beatrice placed the letter from the safe on the table. Arthur's letter to Lawrence, written in 1984, the handwriting unsteady, with whatever combination of pressure and grief had governed his hand when he wrote it. Eleanor read it. She read it slowly, which was the only pace appropriate for a document that contained in 2 pages the entirety of what her husband had known and had tried to put on record before the possibility of putting anything on record was taken from him. When she finished, she folded it along its creases and held it in her hands. She said, "He knew what Lawrence had done, even before the trial." "Yes," Beatrice said. Eleanor set the letter down carefully. "I don't want revenge," she said. "I want you to know that. I have had 40 years to want revenge, and I discovered quite early that wanting it didn't help anything." She looked at the drawing on the table at Arthur's signature. "I want people to know he wasn't a criminal. That is the only thing I have ever wanted from any of this. Just that people know." Beatrice reached across the table and placed her hand over Eleanor's. She said, "That is exactly what we are going to do, not for money, not for what it costs them, because the record is wrong and the record should be correct. That is what we are going to do." Eleanor looked at her for a long moment. Then she stood with the deliberateness of someone who has made a decision and went to the small dresser against the wall and opened the top drawer and reached to the back of it and removed an envelope. She brought it to the table and set it down. It was the color of old paper, soft at the folds, addressed in handwriting that Beatrice recognized immediately because she had spent the past 2 weeks learning to recognize it. Arthur's hand precise and careful even in whatever circumstances he had been writing from. The postmark was 1998, the year he died. Eleanor said, "He sent this a week before. I knew what it probably was, and I couldn't." She sat down. "I put it in the drawer, and I have looked at it many times, and I have never been able to open it." She looked at Beatrice. "I think I can now," she said, "if you will stay." The Pemberton Energy Board met on the 3rd Thursday of every month in the conference room on the 14th floor of the company's headquarters, a room that Beatrice had entered twice in 42 years, both times as Lawrence's wife at ceremonial occasions, both times standing slightly to the side, in the way that the wives of important men learn to stand when the importance belongs to someone else. She arrived at 9:50 for a 10 o'clock meeting she had not been invited to. She had called Morgan the previous evening. She had not told him what she was bringing. She had said only that she needed to address the board before the meeting began, and that it was important, and that she was asking him as her son to allow it. There had been a long silence, and then he had said yes in the voice of someone who does not know what they are agreeing to, but who understands that the request carries a weight that cannot be dismissed. Jasper was in the lobby when she arrived. He was wearing a suit that had been good quality when it was new, and that still carried itself with the residual dignity of good tailoring, and he had the bearing of a man who has decided that something he should have done 40 years ago will be done today, and is at peace with the decision if not with its lateness. Dr. Helena Voss was already in the elevator when they reached it, a woman in her late 50s with the compact efficiency of someone accustomed to appearing in rooms where her presence would settle questions. She had examined the documents over 2 days the previous week and had produced a report of 31 pages that reached its conclusion in the first paragraph and spent the remaining 30 pages making that conclusion technically unassailable. Eleanor had not come. Beatrice had not asked her to. Eleanor had done what she needed to do by existing by being 66 years old in a small apartment on Clement Street with 40 years of a wrong understanding of her husband's life, by opening the letter from the drawer and reading it with Beatrice beside her, by saying afterward in the quiet of that small room that she trusted Beatrice to carry what needed to be carried into whatever room it needed to reach. The receptionist on the 14th floor looked at Beatrice with the uncertain expression of someone who recognizes a face from photographs but cannot reconcile the person in the photographs with the person standing in front of her, because the person in the photographs had always been adjacent to Lawrence, and the person standing here was alone and was carrying an archival box with the purposeful ease of someone who knows exactly what she is carrying. Beatrice gave her name. She said she was expected. The conference room had the specific quality of spaces designed to communicate authority glass on 2 sides, looking out over the city, a table long enough that the people at its far end were at a conversational distance that required effort, 14 chairs occupied by 14 people in the careful clothing of institutional power. Morgan was at the head. Diana was 2 seats to his right, which was the position she had arranged for herself on the board 3 years ago. The room looked at Beatrice when she entered. She had considered in the days of preparation what she would wear. She had decided on the same things she wore when she had worked at the university: dark trousers and a good blouse, and the cardigan that she had owned for 12 years, and that fit correctly. She was not performing anything, she was simply dressed. She set the archival box on the table. Morgan said her name and stood not because the situation called for it exactly, but because he was her son, and some things operate below the level of circumstance. Diana said, "Mom, this isn't the right time or place for—" "I'll be brief," Beatrice said. She opened the box. She had organized the contents in the order she intended to present them, which was the chronological order, because the chronological order was the truthful order, and the truthful order was the only one that worked. She placed the drawing first. She said, "This is a technical drawing dated October 17, 1982. It is titled Finchley Solid State Cell, Drawing Number 1. The signature in the lower right corner belongs to Arthur Finchley, a physicist at the University of Northern California, confirmed by the laboratory's institutional stamp. Dr. Voss." Helena Voss placed her report on the table beside the drawing, open to the relevant page, and said in the even tone of expert testimony, "I have examined this document using standard forensic methods, including ink dating paper composition analysis and institutional stamp verification. The document is consistent in all measurable characteristics with authentic production in October 1982. There is no evidence of alteration or retroactive creation." Beatrice placed the 3 notebooks beside the drawing. She said, "These are Arthur Finchley's laboratory notebooks covering March through December 1982. They document the complete development of the solid-state battery technology from initial concept through final formulation. Every page carries Dr. Finchley's name. Dr. Voss has verified their authenticity." She placed the letter from the safe. She said, "This is a letter written by Arthur Finchley to Lawrence Pemberton in 1984 after Arthur's conviction. It was found in a safe in the attic of the Pemberton estate. It had been there for 40 years. She looked at the room. 14 people were looking at the drawing and the notebooks and the letter with the quality of attention that descends on a room when it understands that something is happening that cannot be taken back. Diana said, "This is outrageous. These documents could have come from anywhere. Mom, I don't know what you think you're doing, but you are not qualified to walk in here and make accusations against Dad based on—" "Mr. Quince," Beatrice said. Jasper stepped forward. He said his name and his former position and the year he had worked at the patent office. He described in the careful language of a man who has rehearsed accuracy rather than impact what he had seen in 1983, and what he had done and what he had not done. He placed the copy of Arthur's provisional patent application on the table beside Lawrence's approved patent, both documents dated, both describing the same technology 14 months apart. He said, "I was paid to withdraw a memo that would have flagged the conflict. I withdrew it. I have lived with that for 40 years. I am providing this testimony now because it is the correct thing to do and because I am running out of time in which to do it." Diana said, "This is a conspiracy. This is—" Morgan said, "Diana." One word, Diana stopped. Morgan had not spoken since Beatrice entered the room. He had sat at the head of the table with his hands flat on the surface and his eyes moving from document to document with the expression of someone performing a calculation that he does not want to complete. He was 45 years old. He had grown up with Lawrence's genius as the founding fact of his life, the thing around which everything else had organized itself. His father's intelligence, his father's vision, the stories Lawrence told about the laboratory, about the breakthrough, about the moment of understanding that had changed everything. Morgan had heard these stories so many times that they had become structural part of the architecture of who he believed himself to be and where he came from. He stood up. The room went very quiet. He said, "Can I see the drawing?" It was not quite a question. Beatrice slid it across the table toward him. He picked it up with both hands. He looked at it the way she had looked at it in the attic, with the full attention of someone who understands that they are holding something that is going to require them to revise a great deal. He looked at the date. He looked at the signature. He looked at the institutional stamp. He put the drawing down and picked up Lawrence's patent application beside it, the one Jasper had brought, and he looked at the date on that. October 1982, December 1983. 14 months. She watched her son's face go through several things, none of which she could have named precisely, before it arrived at the expression that it settled into. It was not anger. It was not denial. It was the expression of a man who has just understood something that cannot be ununderstood, and who is deciding in real time what kind of person he is going to be about it. He set the patent application down. He said, "Dad lied to all of us." His voice was not loud. It had the quality of something said into a very large quiet, a stone dropped into deep water, the sound small and the displacement not. Diana made a sound that was not words. Morgan looked at his mother. She looked back at him and said nothing because there was nothing she needed to say. She had brought what needed to be brought into this room. What happened next was not hers to determine. It was his. The story broke on a Friday morning. Beatrice was sitting at the kitchen table in the Pemberton estate with her second cup of coffee when her phone began to ring for the first time, and by the time she had decided not to answer it, it had rung 4 more times from 4 different numbers she did not recognize. She turned the phone face down and looked out the window at the garden that she had tended for 38 years, and that looked exactly as it always had, which was its own kind of information. She had given the documents to a journalist the previous afternoon. She had chosen carefully, which was how she did everything. The journalist was a woman named Prescott who had spent 15 years covering corporate accountability for a publication with the kind of institutional credibility that meant her work was read by the people who made decisions about investigations and regulatory responses. Beatrice had sent her a message through the publication's general contact form, 2 days after the board meeting, which had given her time to prepare the accompanying documentation correctly labeled and cross-referenced in the way that a librarian prepares materials that need to be navigated by someone who did not create the system. Prescott had called within the hour. They had met the following morning. Beatrice had laid out the documents in chronological order on the table in Prescott's office and had explained each one in sequence with the same precision she would have used to orient a graduate student to a new collection. Prescott had published the following day. The article was long and carefully sourced and contained the full forensic report from Dr. Voss, the testimony of Jasper Quince identified by name and former position, and a timeline constructed from the documents that was Beatrice felt accurate in every particular. Prescott had also obtained the trial transcript from 1984, which was public record, and which contained Lawrence's testimony in his own words. The testimony of a 28-year-old man describing financial irregularities he claimed to have discovered testimony that the forensic evidence now established as fabricated. By noon, the article had been republished in 14 outlets. By evening, Pemberton Energy stock had fallen 31%. Beatrice sat with the phone face down and drank her coffee and watched the garden. Morgan called at 7 that evening, and she answered. He said he had read everything. He said he had been reading since the article published and had not stopped going through the documents she had sent him the morning after the board meeting, the copies she had made for him, specifically because she had known he would need them and had not wanted him to have to ask. He said he had called 2 people he trusted who were not connected to the company and had asked them to read the documents independently and tell him what they saw. He said they had told him what she had told the board. His voice had the quality she had heard in it, the boardroom, the quality of a man who has lost something very large and is determining in real time what the loss requires of him. She said, "What are you going to do?" He said, "The right thing, I think. I'm trying to figure out what that looks like." She said, "I know." He held a press conference the following morning. She watched it on the television in the sitting room, the room where Diana had told her about the Whitebridge apartments 3 weeks ago. And she watched her son stand in front of a room full of journalists and cameras with the particular stillness of someone who has decided to stop performing and is experiencing for the first time how much energy the performance had been consuming. He spoke for 12 minutes. He described what the documents showed. He said that the foundation of Pemberton Energy's intellectual property had been established through the misappropriation of another person's work, and that this was not a disputed interpretation of complex events, but a documented fact. He said that Arthur Finchley had developed the technology that the company had been built on, and that Arthur Finchley had spent 25 years in a federal penitentiary for a crime that Lawrence Pemberton's false testimony had created. He said that he had spent 45 years believing a story about his father that was not true, and that he did not think the correct response to discovering that was to protect the story. He said he was resigning as CEO effective immediately. He said the board would appoint an interim executive and would cooperate fully with the Patent Office investigation and any related legal proceedings. He said one more thing at the end, which she had not expected. He said that his mother had found the truth and had brought it forward, and that he believed this had required more courage than most people would understand, and that he was grateful to her, and that he was sorry it had taken this long. Diana arrived at the estate at 3 p.m. Beatrice heard the car in the drive, and then the front door, and then Diana's footsteps, which she had known since Diana was old enough to walk, and which carried even now the particular quality of a person who moves through spaces with the assumption of ownership. Diana came into the sitting room and looked at her mother. She had been crying for some time, which was visible, and she had not done anything about this which was less characteristic. Diana had always managed her appearance with the same attention she brought to everything she considered important. The fact that she had not managed it now was its own kind of information. She said, "You destroyed everything." Beatrice looked at her daughter. At the 48 years of her, the specific person she had become, the person who had learned from Lawrence how to occupy a room and from the family's position how to understand her place in a hierarchy, and who had built her entire sense of herself on both of these inheritances. She said, "Your father destroyed it. He destroyed it in 1982 when he took Arthur Finchley's work. He destroyed it in 1984 when he testified falsely and put Arthur in prison. He destroyed it every year for 40 years while he built a company on what he had stolen. I found it. That is different." Diana said, "He was our father." "He was," Beatrice said. And he was also a man who did those things. Both of those things are true. They have always both been true. Diana looked at her with the expression of someone who has encountered a wall where they expected a door. Beatrice said, "I know this is destroying something you believed in. I know what that costs. I am not telling you it doesn't cost anything." She looked at her daughter steadily. "I am telling you that Arthur Finchley also had a family. He had a wife who visited him for 8 years, until she couldn't anymore, and who lived alone in a small apartment for 40 years believing her husband was a criminal. I met her. I sat in her apartment. I watched her touch her husband's signature on a drawing she had never known existed." Diana did not say anything. "Your father loved you," Beatrice said. "I believe that. He loved Morgan, and he loved you, and he loved me in the way he was capable of loving people. And he spent 40 years carrying something he couldn't put down and couldn't talk about, which is its own kind of damage." She paused. "But Eleanor Finchley spent 40 years too, and she didn't choose it." Diana sat down, not deliberately, not in the way of someone choosing to sit, but in the way of someone whose legs have made the decision for them. She sat on the edge of the sofa with her hands in her lap, and she looked at the floor, and she did not speak for a long time. Beatrice waited. Outside, the garden was doing what it did in November, going quiet, and internal, drawing its energy downward in the way of things that understand that some seasons require withdrawal rather than display. The phone rang. It was Jasper. His voice had the quality it had carried since the board meeting, the quality of a man who has set something down after 40 years and is still learning what it feels like to have empty hands. He said, "The preliminary ruling came through an hour ago." He said it in the measured tone of someone delivering information they have been waiting to deliver for a very long time and who wants to get it right. He said, "The Patent Office has made an initial determination. The 1983 patent is void. The intellectual property underlying Pemberton Energy's core technology is being returned to the estate of Arthur Finchley." The room was very quiet. Beatrice looked at the archival box on the table, which was empty now, because all of its contents were in the hands of the people and institutions that needed them. An empty archival box. She had started with a full safe beneath a floorboard, and she had ended with an empty box on a table, and between those two things was a truth that had been waiting for 40 years to be correctly filed. She said, "Thank you, Jasper." She ended the call. Diana was still sitting on the edge of the sofa looking at the floor, and Beatrice looked at her daughter and felt the complicated love of a mother for a child who has been built partly from a lie and who is now having to find out what she is made of without it. She said, "Eleanor Finchley is going to be all right." Diana did not respond. Beatrice said, "I think you will be too, eventually." She picked up the empty archival box and carried it to the study and put it away. The patent was formally amended on a Thursday in April. Beatrice learned of it through Jasper, who called at 8 in the morning with the particular quality of voice she had come to associate with him when he was delivering something he had waited a long time to deliver. The United States Patent and Trademark Office had completed its review. The 1983 patent was void. A corrected patent had been issued bearing the original priority date of October 17, 1982, and the name of the sole inventor, Arthur Finchley. She sat with this for a moment at the kitchen table in the estate, which was no longer the Pemberton estate, in the way it had been the Pemberton estate, because names are not permanent in the way that certain men believe they are. She sat with her coffee, and the morning light coming through the windows, and she thought about a man she had never met, who had worked in a laboratory 40 years ago with the patience and rigor that his notebooks documented so completely, and she thought about what it meant that his name was now on the thing he had made. She called Eleanor. Eleanor answered on the first ring, which meant she had been waiting, which meant Jasper had called her first, or she had already known from some other channel, because the world in which this was happening was smaller than it appeared. And Eleanor had more people paying attention to her situation now than at any previous point in the 40 years that situation had existed. Eleanor said, "I heard." Beatrice said, "How are you?" A pause. Then Eleanor said, "I feel like someone opened a window in a room that had been closed for a very long time." She paused again. I don't quite know what to do with the heir yet. The financial transfer took 3 additional months to complete because the amounts involved and the complexity of the intellectual property licensing structure required the kind of careful work that cannot be rushed without creating the errors that litigation exploits. Jasper oversaw the legal process with the focused attention of a man completing the work he had avoided 40 years ago, and Dr. Voss provided additional testimony as required, and Morgan cooperated fully with every aspect of the proceedings in the way of someone who has decided that cooperation is the only honest position available to him. Eleanor received $2.1 billion. Beatrice had been present when Eleanor was told the final number. They had been sitting in Eleanor's apartment on Clement Street, which Eleanor had not yet left, because she had not yet decided what leaving would mean, and the attorney had said the number in the careful tone of someone who has learned not to let large numbers sound like anything other than facts. Eleanor had looked at the wall where Arthur's photograph hung. She had looked at it for a long time. Then she had said, "I know what to do with it." The Arthur Finchley Foundation was established in June. Its purpose was specific and deliberately modest in scope, which was characteristic of Eleanor, and which Beatrice had come to understand was also characteristic of Arthur, based on everything she had learned about him over 6 months of reconstructing a life from documents and testimony. The foundation provided research funding for early career scientists in the physical sciences whose work showed genuine promise, but who lacked institutional support or financial backing. People like Arthur at 32 before anyone knew what he was working on. Eleanor had insisted on one additional provision. The Foundation's selection committee would include in perpetuity 1 working scientist and 1 librarian. She had looked at Beatrice when she said this, and Beatrice had understood without it being explained. The library had been Beatrice's idea, or rather it had been the idea that was waiting for her, once the other things were resolved. The idea that had formed itself quietly in the background of the 6 months of legal process and public attention and the specific exhaustion of having done something large and consequential and now needing to find what came after. The university had been after some initial institutional hesitation that was understandable and that Morgan had helped to address fully cooperative. They had a building on the eastern edge of campus that had been scheduled for renovation, and they had a naming opportunity. And they had a growing awareness that the story of what had happened in their applied physics laboratory 40 years ago was part of their institutional history, and that the only dignified response to that history was to incorporate it honestly. The Arthur Finchley Memorial Library opened on a Friday morning in October. The date was not accidental. The building had been designed with the same principle Eleanor had applied to the foundation, and Beatrice had applied to 35 years of library work, which was that a space for knowledge should be organized around the needs of the people using it, rather than the preferences of the people funding it. There was natural light in every reading room. The reference collection was arranged for navigation rather than display. The special collections vault had a viewing room with proper archival lighting and a table large enough that 2 people could examine documents side by side. On the wall of the main reading room at eye level, in a frame that Beatrice had selected herself from a framer in the city who understood what the contents required, was the original drawing. Finchley Solid State Cell. Drawing number 1. October 17, 1982. Arthur Finchley, his signature in the lower right corner exactly as he had placed it, witnessed and stamped and permanent in the way of things that were made to be permanent. Beside the frame, a small placard, the drawing's provenance accurately stated, the date of the patent correction, the name of the foundation. Eleanor and Beatrice cut the ribbon together. Eleanor's hands were steady, which Beatrice noted because she had expected otherwise, and was glad to be wrong. Morgan stood behind them with the expression of a man who is present at something that is costing him a great deal, and who has decided that the cost is correct. Diana had not come, which was her right, and which Beatrice had accepted in the way she had come to accept many things about her daughter, with love and without resolution. There were students in the building within the first hour. Young people with laptops and notebooks settling into the reading rooms with the natural ease of people occupying a space that has been designed for them. Beatrice stood in the doorway of the main reading room and watched them and felt what she had felt at the conclusion of every reference question successfully resolved in 35 years of work, the specific satisfaction of a need correctly met. In the late afternoon, after the opening events had concluded and the staff had begun the ordinary work of a library finding its rhythm, Beatrice went alone to the main reading room. She stood in front of the drawing. She had looked at it many times over the past 6 months in the archival box, on the boardroom table, in the patent office examiner's hands, in the journalist's office, in Eleanor's apartment. She had looked at it as evidence, as documentation, as the primary source from which everything else derived. She looked at it now as what it also was, a man's work, a particular mind's encounter with a particular problem documented in the specific language of technical drawing with the care of someone who understood that the record mattered. October 17th, 1982, a Thursday, she had looked it up. A man in a laboratory on a Thursday in October completing something he had worked toward for years, signing his name to it because it was his. She placed her hand against the glass of the frame beside the signature. She said, "Thank you for not giving up." She meant the letter he had written to Lawrence, which was an act of not giving up. She meant the notebooks, which were an act of not giving up. She meant the letter he had sent to Eleanor from prison, which she had read at Eleanor's table, and which had contained in its final paragraph something she had thought about many times since. Arthur had written that he did not know if the truth would ever be known. He had written that he had tried to ensure it could be known if someone ever looked. He had written that this was the only thing left available to him, and that he had done it because he believed that the record, however imperfect, was worth keeping. The record was worth keeping. She lowered her hand. She was 68 years old, and she had spent 35 years as a librarian and 42 years as a wife, and 6 months as the person who had opened a safe and followed what was inside it to its correct conclusion. She did not know what came next with the precision she would have preferred. She knew that Eleanor was establishing a foundation, and that Morgan was finding his way towards something he could stand behind, and that Diana was somewhere in the process of dismantling a story she had lived inside and determining what was underneath it. She knew that a journalist had called that morning and asked if she had regrets. She had thought about the question with the attention it deserved, because it deserved attention. She had said, "I didn't destroy my husband's legacy. I returned it to its rightful owner. That isn't destruction. That is a debt repaid." The journalist had asked a follow-up question. She had not answered it. Some conclusions are complete as they are and do not require elaboration. Outside the library windows, the October light was doing what October light does in Northern California, going gold and lateral in the late afternoon, the kind of light that makes everything it touches look like it has always been exactly where it is. Eleanor was on the bench outside the main entrance when Beatrice came through the doors. She had not left after the opening. She had found the bench and sat down, and she was sitting there now with the settled quality of someone who has arrived somewhere and is simply being there, which is different from waiting. Beatrice sat beside her. They did not speak immediately. The campus moved around them, students on their way to other places, the ordinary motion of an institution that continues regardless of what any particular day has meant to any particular people. Eleanor said quietly, "He would have loved this place." Beatrice said, "I know." They sat together in the October light and watched the students go in and out of the doors of the Arthur Finchley Memorial Library, and the afternoon went on around them in the way that afternoons go on, and the building stood where it stood with his name on it, which was where his name had always belonged. If you have stayed with Beatrice and Eleanor through everything that needed to be said, you already understand that this was never only a story about a stolen patent or a fallen empire or a safe beneath a floorboard. It was about what a record is for. It was about the specific courage of a man who knew he was losing everything and chose to document the truth anyway, for whoever might eventually look. It was about a woman who had spent 35 years learning to read documents correctly and who applied that skill at 68 to the most important document she would ever find. And it was about two women who had each lived inside the same lie from opposite sides, and who had found each other, and who had together done what neither could have done alone. If this is your first time with Widow's Legacy, there is more here waiting for you. And if you have been with us from the beginning, we will see you in the next one.